My name is Daniel Hartley, and for 31 years, the northeast corner of my property held something no HOA committee could ever plant, buy, or replicate: my grandfather's orchard. 12 apple trees, 3 pear trees, and a single stubborn old walnut tree that had outlived 2 hurricanes and 1 very determined beetle infestation. My grandfather, Walter Hartley, planted that orchard with his own 2 hands in 1974, back when the land was just a stretch of red Georgia clay and a dream. He used to say that an orchard was a promise. You don't plant a tree for yourself, you plant it for the people who come after you. I never understood how true that was until the day a stranger with a clipboard stood at my fence line and told me none of it was mine. Let me back up. When my grandfather passed away 8 years ago, he left the house and the 2 acres surrounding it to my father, and when my father passed 3 years after that, it came to me. I moved in with my wife, Rachel, and our daughter, Emma, who was 6 at the time. Emma grew up thinking apples came from our backyard, not from a grocery store, and honestly, I love that she believed that, because it was true. Every October would have what we called harvest weekend. Neighbors would come by, kids would climb the lower branches, and we'd press cider in an old hand crank press that had belonged to my grandfather's father before him. It wasn't just fruit. It was history you could taste. Our neighborhood, Willow Creek Estates, had an HOA, like most modern developments do. When my grandfather built the house, there was no HOA. It came later, in the late 1990s, when the empty lots around us finally got developed and a management company convinced everyone that shared landscaping and a community pool were worth a monthly fee. My grandfather, ever the skeptic, joined reluctantly. He used to joke that HOAs were government for people who didn't get enough of it at the DMV. I laughed at that for years. I didn't know yet how right he was. Growing up, I spent nearly every summer at that house. My parents lived 2 towns over, but I'd stay with my grandparents for weeks at a time, mostly because my grandfather had promised to teach me how to graft a pear branch onto an apple rootstock, a trick he'd learned from his own father back in Ohio before the family moved south. He was patient in a way that few adults are with kids. He'd let me hold the grafting knife myself by the time I was 10, guiding my hand without ever grabbing it away from me. You don't learn anything by watching, he used to say. You learn by almost cutting your thumb off and then not doing that again. The orchard wasn't large by farm standards, but it was meticulously kept. He rotated mulch, hand-pruned every tree every February, and kept a leather-bound logbook, which I still have, recording the yield of every harvest since 1975. Rainfall totals. Pest outbreaks. The year a late frost killed almost half the pear blossoms. The year the walnut tree produced so much that they had to give bushels away to half the street. It wasn't just farming to him. It was a kind of quiet devotion, the same way some men keep meticulous records of a classic car they're restoring. Except his project bore fruit every single autumn, more reliably than almost anything else in his life. When the HOA was established, I remember him coming home from that very first informational meeting looking unusually irritated. He sat at the kitchen table, poured himself a glass of sweet tea, and told my grandmother, "They want to put my trees on some map as shared green space." I told them absolutely not. My grandmother, who had a gift for diffusing him with humor, just said, "Well, did you tell them nicely?" He hadn't. But apparently he'd told them clearly enough, and with enough documentation, that they backed off and put it in writing. That piece of paper sat quietly in a folder for the next 25 years, doing nothing, needing to do nothing, until suddenly it needed to do everything. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in March. I remember it was a Tuesday because I was drinking my coffee, running late for a client call. I do freelance architectural drafting from home, when I heard a car door slam outside. I looked out the window and saw a woman in a blazer, clipboard in hand, staking little orange flags into the ground along the edge of my orchard. Not near the orchard. In it. Between the 4th and 5th apple tree. I went outside in my socks, which in hindsight was not my most dignified moment, and asked her what she was doing. "Hi there," she said, with the kind of smile that customer service representatives use right before they deliver bad news. "I'm Deborah Klein, Compliance Officer for Willow Creek Estates HOA. We are doing a boundary survey update. This section here," she gestured at my trees, "has been reclassified as shared common area per the updated site plan." I asked her to repeat that, because I genuinely thought I had misheard. She didn't blink. The original developer's plat included a green space easement along this boundary. It looks like the trees were planted encroaching on that easement. The board voted last month to formalize community access to the area. I told her, politely at first, that this was my grandfather's orchard, that it had been here since before the HOA existed, since before half the houses in this neighborhood were even built. She just nodded, the way people nod when they're not actually listening, and said I could address concerns at the next board meeting. I asked her who, exactly, had approved this reclassification, and she flipped through a few pages on her clipboard before telling me it had come from a site plan review conducted by the management company, and that the board had simply ratified the recommendation. I asked if I could see the site plan she was referencing. She hesitated, then said that wasn't something she was authorized to share directly, but that it would be available for review at the meeting. Something about the way she said authorized stuck with me. It was the language of someone reciting a script rather than someone confident in the underlying facts. Before she left, she handed me a glossy treefold pamphlet titled Willow Creek Community Spaces, Enhancing Shared Value for All Residents, which included a rendering of what looked suspiciously like a gazebo and a small seating area sketched directly on top of where my third and fourth apple trees currently stood. I remember staring at that pamphlet for a long time after she drove off, my coffee going cold on the porch railing, Emma's old tire swing creaking gently in the breeze from the same oak tree my grandfather had hung it on 15 years earlier. I want to be honest with you, my first instinct wasn't anger. It was confusion. Because I knew, this land was mine. I had the deed. I had the property survey from when we refinanced the mortgage 5 years earlier. This didn't make sense. But confusion doesn't stay confusion for long when someone is threatening the thing you love. That night, I dug through the old filing cabinet in my grandfather's former study, now my office, and found the folder marked Property, Original. Inside was the 1974 deed, hand-typed, slightly yellowed, with my grandfather's signature at the bottom in that careful, deliberate handwriting he always used for anything official. The deed described the property boundaries in old-fashioned meets and bounds language. Distances, directions, reference points. I couldn't fully parse it myself, but I could see clearly that the description covered a significantly larger footprint than what the HOA was now claiming was common area. More importantly, there was something else in that folder, a supplemental agreement from 1998, signed when the HOA was first established, explicitly listing my grandfather's parcel as excluded from common area designations due to pre-existing agricultural use. My grandfather, it turned out, had fought this exact battle before, decades earlier, when the original developer tried to fold his orchard into the shared landscaping plan for the new subdivision. He'd won. And he'd kept the paperwork, tucked away like a landmine waiting for someone to need it again. Tucked behind the supplemental agreement was something I hadn't expected. A short, handwritten letter, undated, but clearly written sometime in the late 1990s, judging by the stationery. It was addressed to no one in particular, more of a private note to himself than a letter meant to be sent. In his familiar block handwriting, he'd written, kept the agreement. Filed a copy with the county besides the one in this drawer, in case anyone ever tries something clever. An orchard isn't worth much on paper, but it's worth everything to the people who eat from it. Whoever reads this after me, don't let them talk you out of what's yours just because they sound official. I sat there for a long moment holding that note, feeling like my grandfather had somehow reached across the years and put a hand on my shoulder at exactly the right moment. I felt something odd standing there in his old study, holding that paper. Pride, mostly. But also a strange responsibility, like he'd left me more than a house. He'd left me an argument, fully loaded, just waiting for the right moment. The right moment came 2 weeks later, at the HOA board meeting. I'll admit, I went in expecting a fight, and a small part of me, the part that had grown up watching too many courtroom dramas, wanted to slap the deed on the table like a MIC drop. But Rachel talked me down. Be calm, be clear, bring the paperwork, let the paperwork do the talking, she said. She's a paralegal, and she's usually right about these things. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, in a room that smelled like stale coffee and new carpet. Around the table sat 5 board members, including the HOA president, a man named Roger Castellan, who I'd only ever exchanged waves with at the mailbox. Deborah Klein sat off to the side with her clipboard, looking exactly as unbothered as she had on my lawn. There were maybe a dozen other residents scattered in folding chairs behind me, most of them there for an unrelated agenda item about pool hours, though a few perked up noticeably once they realized someone was about to publicly challenge the board. Roger opened the floor to community concerns, and I stood up. My name is Daniel Hartley. I live at 214 Millbrook Lane. 2 weeks ago, a representative of this HOA staked flags through my family's orchard and informed me it had been reclassified as common area. I'm here to formally object, and I have documentation. I laid out 3 things on the table: the 1974 deed, the 1998 supplemental agreement excluding the parcel from common designations, and a current certified survey showing the orchard entirely within my property lines, not encroaching on any easement. Roger flipped through the papers slowly. I watched his face shift from mild irritation to something more careful. "This is an older document," he said, tapping the 1998 agreement. "I'm not sure this supersedes the current governing documents. The board's decision was based on the developer's most recent site plan filed with the county." "With respect," I said, "the county recorder's office would have both documents on file. A more recent internal HOA site plan doesn't override a recorded property deed and an existing exclusion agreement. That's not how real property law works." There was a pause. One of the other board members, a woman named Linda Okafor, leaned over and whispered something to Roger. I couldn't hear it, but I saw Roger's jaw tighten slightly. "We'll need to review this with our attorney," Roger said finally. "We'll table the item." I want to tell you that was the end of it. That reason prevailed on the spot and everyone shook hands and had cider. But real life rarely wraps up that neatly, and this story is no different. 3 days later, I received a letter, an actual certified letter, the kind that requires a signature, informing me that the HOA's legal counsel had reviewed the matter and determined that the 1998 agreement was non-binding due to a lack of proper board ratification at the time of signing, and that the reclassification of the orchard as common area would proceed as planned, with community access scheduled to open the following month. I read that letter twice, then a third time, standing in my driveway while Emma rode her bike in circles behind me, blissfully unaware that someone was trying to take her great-grandfather's trees. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I know how to read carefully, and something about that phrase, lack of proper board ratification, struck me as oddly specific. Like someone had gone looking for a technicality rather than simply accepting the facts. So I did what anyone with a healthy dose of stubbornness and a decent internet connection would do. I went to the county clerk's office. The records building downtown was one of those places I'd driven past 1,000 times without ever once considering walking inside. It had that particular hush that government archives have: fluorescent lights, the low hum of old copy machines, the faint smell of paper that's been sitting in climate-controlled storage for decades. I explained what I was looking for to a woman at the front desk, and she directed me to microfilm records for HOA filings predating the county's digital system, which apparently only went back to 2004. It took me 2 visits and a very patient records clerk named Pam to track down the original meeting minutes from 1998. Pam, it turned out, had worked at that office for over 20 years and had a genuine soft spot for what she called the old paper trail people, meaning residents who actually bothered to dig instead of just calling and complaining. She pulled 3 separate microfilm reels before we found the right one, and I remember the particular satisfaction of watching the minutes scroll into view on that old projector screen, the text slightly blurred but unmistakably clear enough to read. And there it was, in black and white, typed on an actual typewriter judging by the font, a unanimous board vote, 5 members present, approving the exclusion agreement for the Hartley parcel due to established agricultural and horticultural use predating community development. Signed, dated, notarized, fully ratified. Pam printed me 3 certified copies on the spot and even initialed the back of each one, just in case I needed to prove later that they'd come directly from the county archive rather than something I'd typed up myself. The HOA's attorney had either not looked hard enough, or had assumed I wouldn't look at all. I made copies. I made a lot of copies. I also did something I probably should have done from the start. I hired my own real estate attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Chandrasekharan, who specialized in property disputes. Rachel had actually worked with her firm briefly years earlier and vouched for her without hesitation. When I laid out the whole situation for her, spreading the deed, the supplemental agreement, the certified 1998 minutes, and the recent survey across her conference table, she actually laughed, not unkindly, and said, "Mr. Hartley, this isn't even a close case. Your grandfather did the hard work for you 30 years ago. We just have to make sure they know that." Priya spent about 20 minutes going through everything methodically, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When had the survey been conducted? Had I received anything in writing before the certified letter? Had any HOA representative entered my property without permission? She made a note of the flag staking incident, explaining that even something as small as that could matter later if this ended up needing to go further than a strongly worded letter. Priya drafted a formal cease and desist letter, citing the recorded deed, the notarized 1998 agreement, and the current certified survey. She noted, politely but firmly, that any attempt to grant community access to a privately owned, non-easement parcel could constitute trespass, and that continued action by the HOA could expose the association, and potentially individual board members, to liability. That letter went out on a Thursday. By the following Monday, I had a voicemail from Roger Castellan, sounding considerably less confident than he had at the board meeting, asking if we could find a path forward that works for everyone. We met again, this time not in the clubhouse, but in Priya's office, which I think was a deliberate choice on her part. Neutral ground, professional setting, no home field advantage for the board. Roger came with the HOA's attorney, a tired-looking man named Frank Ostrovsky who, it turned out, had only been retained a year earlier and clearly hadn't dug through decades of archived paperwork before advising the board. Priya laid out the documentation, calmly and thoroughly, walking Frank through each document in order: the original deed, the boundary description, the 1998 supplemental agreement, and finally the certified county minutes confirming ratification. Frank reviewed it, occasionally glancing at Roger with an expression that said, quite clearly, "Why didn't anyone check this first?" At one point he asked to see the original source of the reclassification recommendation, and Roger admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that the updated site plan Deborah Klein had referenced was actually an internal landscaping proposal drafted by the management company, never filed with the county at all, and never intended to override existing property records in the first place. It had simply been misread, or misused, as a legal basis for reclassification. The 1998 agreement is valid, Frank finally admitted. It was properly ratified. I'll be honest, the file I was given didn't include these minutes. I was working off a summary prepared by the previous management company. Priya nodded, unsurprised. I'd recommend the board issue a formal written retraction of the common area reclassification, along with an acknowledgement that Mr. Hartley's property was never subject to it. We'd also ask that the association cover the survey and legal costs incurred in resolving what was, ultimately, a documentation failure on the HOA's part. There was some back and forth, some hedging about budgets and precedent, but in the end, they agreed. 2 weeks later, I received a formal letter, this one much friendlier in tone, retracting the reclassification entirely and confirming, in writing, that the orchard parcel was excluded from common area designation in perpetuity, consistent with the recorded 1998 agreement. They also reimbursed the survey fee and half of my legal costs, which Priya said was actually a pretty good outcome, all things considered. I'd love to tell you that Deborah Klein personally apologized, or that Roger Castellan brought over a fruit basket as a peace offering. Neither of those things happened. What did happen was quieter, and honestly, more satisfying. At the next board meeting, which I attended purely out of curiosity, the association adopted a new policy requiring a full title and deed history review before any property could be reclassified for common use. They called it, a little clumsily, the Hartley provision. I didn't ask for that. I didn't need my name on anything. But I won't pretend it didn't feel good to hear it. A few residents came up to me afterward, including a couple 2 streets over who mentioned, almost in passing, that they'd also received a strange letter a year earlier about a drainage easement that never seemed to hold up when they'd asked questions about it. It made me wonder how many small, quiet victories like mine never happen simply because someone didn't have an old filing cabinet, or didn't think to check, or assumed a letter with an official-looking letterhead couldn't possibly be wrong. I started keeping better records after that, not just for the orchard, but for everything. Insurance documents, warranty paperwork, even old receipts for home repairs. My grandfather's habit of keeping everything, which used to seem almost excessive to me as a kid, suddenly made a lot more sense. That October, we had harvest weekend as usual. The orange survey flags were long gone, pulled up the same week the retraction letter arrived. Emma, older now, helped run the cider press for the first time without help, her hands finding the same worn wooden handle her great-grandfather's hands had worn smooth decades earlier. Rachel made her cinnamon apple bread, the smell drifting through the whole yard. A few neighbors came by, including, somewhat awkwardly, Linda Okafor from the board, who brought a bottle of wine and told me quietly that she'd voted against the original reclassification, but had been outvoted 3-2. I believed her. I think most disputes like this aren't really about villains and heroes. They're about assumptions. Someone assumes an old deed doesn't matter anymore. Someone assumes a homeowner won't fight back. Someone assumes paperwork from 30 years ago is buried too deep to matter. My grandfather knew better. He always said that the strongest kind of protection isn't a fence or a lock. It's a piece of paper filed correctly, in the right office, with the right signature, at the right time. I think about that a lot now, standing under the walnut tree in late afternoon light, watching Emma climb the same low branch I used to climb, that my father used to climb, that maybe someday her own kids will climb too. The orchard was never just 12 apple trees and 3 pear trees. It was a promise, made in 1974, kept quietly in a filing cabinet for decades, waiting for someone who cared enough to open the folder. If there's a lesson in all of this, and I think there is, it's not really about HOAs, or boards, or bureaucratic overreach, even though there was plenty of that here. It's simpler than that. Keep your paperwork. Know your property. And when someone tells you that something you love isn't really yours, don't just accept it because they said it with confidence and a clipboard. Go check. Sometimes the truth is sitting in a folder, typed on an old typewriter, signed by someone who loved that land long before you were old enough to understand why. My grandfather planted an orchard so that someone, someday, would have shade in the summer and apples in the fall. He never imagined that same orchard would need defending in a boardroom, decades after he first turned that Georgia clay with a shovel. But I like to think he'd be proud that when the moment came, the trees were still standing, and so was I. These days, Willow Creek Estates has a new unofficial rule, one that isn't written in any handbook but that everyone seems to understand. Don't mess with the Hartley orchard. And every October, when the smell of fresh cider drifts over the fence line, I think that's exactly the kind of legacy my grandfather would have wanted. Not a fight won in a boardroom, but a harvest shared with neighbors, on land that was, and always will be, ours. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight to protect something that mattered to your family, let me know in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, real disputes, real documents, real families standing their ground, make sure you're subscribed, because there are plenty more where this came from.